Um, just to say, Davis-Bacon, I've attended a 3-day Department of Labor Davis-Bacon training. So in 1 hour, it's virtually impossible to really, leave making anybody an expert in Davis-Bacon, but we'll try our best and try to gear it for most of the group here. So I guess we can go to the first slide. Introductions. Again, I'm Tim Goff, one of the development specialists at the Division of Housing, and we have...
I am Jennifer DiGianardo. I am one of the asset managers for the Division of Housing.
And I'm Ariel Cisneros. I should have introduced myself earlier, but I am also an asset manager.
Also, what we want to do is kind of get an idea. Well, I'm sorry, for the agenda, we're going to start with some introductions. However, because this is a webinar, we're going to have you just kind of introduce yourself via chat. We're going to cover the basics of what is Davis-Bacon, Davis-Bacon and CDBG, Davis-Bacon and home, other things that might trigger Davis-Bacon, other considerations you might have when determining your project and what might trigger Davis-Bacon, and then the majority of the webinar will be on implementation and compliance. So we've already introduced DOH staff here. So what we would like everybody to do, and DOH attendees, this is optional, but we'd just like to kind of get them an idea of who's on the webinar, what your title is, what kind of an organization you are, if you've got experience with Davis-Bacon, and if there's anything in particular you're hoping to take away today. So if participants would like to start just entering in chat your information, we'll kind of compile that and get to it in a minute here. But we'll go ahead and get started with the rest of the webinar while you're doing that. So what is Davis-Bacon? I'm not going to go into the long history, but the Davis-Bacon Act, it was enacted in 1931. It also had some future amendments in 1935 and 1964. And it's primarily to try to protect local workers from large out-of-state or out-of-the-area contractors coming in and undercutting local contractors. So it makes sure that everybody is going to bid a project based on certain wages. Next slide. So what does Davis-Bacon require? It requires what are often referred to as prevailing wages, along with fringe benefits, to all laborers and mechanics that are going to work on the property. So it applies to all laborers. It's all contractors, subcontractors performing any work on what's called the site of work. And by site of work, that is the actual location of the project being constructed. To kind of use as an example, if something is being fabricated off-site, let's say your metal stair railings or something are being fabricated at the ironworker's shop off-site, the labor to fabricate those stairwells would not be subject to Davis-Bacon. However, when they come to install them on the site, the work that's being performed on the site would be covered by Davis-Bacon. So Davis-Bacon covers specifically work being performed on the site of work. Volunteers, sweat equity, force account labor, youth build trainees, and apprentices are exempt in most circumstances. And just so you know what force account labor is, let's just say that maybe the city of Fort Collins is going to put infrastructure in on the site and they're using their own city employees. That would be considered force account labor. So those individuals would not be subject to the Davis-Bacon requirements. Also, supervisors or foremen who regularly spend at least 20% of their work week performing actual work are also covered by Davis-Bacon. So if you've got an individual that is considered a foreman on the site, but he's a working foreman and he does painting, to use as an example, he does need to be paid at least the painter's wage. Next slide. Also, people on this site must be paid not less than weekly. So you may have situations where a subcontractor normally pays bi-weekly or monthly, but if they are actually doing a Davis-Bacon job, they are going to need to change that and pay weekly during the course of this project. We'll be talking about wage decisions later, but the wage decision must be posted on the job site so that anybody who is working on that job site is able to see what the minimum amount they are supposed to be paid is. Also, when you're preparing to put a project out to bid, you also need to make sure that those bidding know that Davis-Bacon is going to be required in the project. Next slide. So when does Davis-Bacon apply if the project is being funded with CDBG? So it applies to all non-residential construction contracts in excess of $2,000. If you're working with the Division of Housing and getting funding from the Division of Housing, that's almost never going to apply because we are always going to be funding some type of housing. It applies to rehabilitation of residential property only if it's designed for residential use for 8 or more households. And that's also the same for CDBG DR and NSP, which are both considered CDBG funded programs. Prevailing wages are only required when federal funds are used to pay for construction work. Now that's with CDBG. We're going to be discussing home in a minute here. But if you are funding a project with CDBG and you're paying for acquisition of the land, that is not paying for construction. So that in itself would not trigger Davis-Bacon for that project. Prevailing wages, let me see, one note here though, if you're paying for the cost of something that pays for construction, this gets kind of confusing, that does trigger Davis-Bacon. So even though paying interest on a construction loan, you don't necessarily feel like you're paying for construction, but because the construction loan is paying for construction, if you're also paying for those costs, you are technically paying for construction. Davis-Bacon doesn't apply to demolition by itself. So if you were going to fund a project to demolish a home off of a lot and you're not going to be constructing necessarily on that lot, this isn't typically going to apply to something that the Division of Housing would fund, because we wouldn't fund you being able to demolish a house to say turn it into a park, because you're not creating housing. But demolition by itself will not trigger Davis-Bacon. But if it is going to be followed with construction, then the demolition would be covered by Davis-Bacon. And next slide. Just a little reminder here that construction financing may not only be limited to the act of paying for construction work directly. So for instance, you can't pay for the costs of a construction loan, because a construction loan is going to pay for construction. You also can't pay for the cost of the permanent financing if that permanent financing is going to take out the construction loan. So again, if you pay for construction loan costs and if you pay for permanent financing, that in essence will be taking out the construction loan, you are going to trigger Davis-Bacon. And next slide. soft costs do not trigger Davis-Bacon. So again, I already mentioned that you could pay for acquisition of the property and not trigger Davis-Bacon. Purchase of equipment doesn't trigger Davis-Bacon. Architectural and engineering fees wouldn't, paying for those costs wouldn't trigger Davis-Bacon. Other services, legal, accounting. This one, construction management, you'd think that would be paying for construction, but that in itself doesn't trigger Davis-Bacon. Other non-construction items, so furniture, taxes, etc. So you can pay for quite a bit with CDBG without triggering Davis-Bacon. You just got to keep in mind that if you're paying for construction or paying for something that pays for construction, you will trigger Davis-Bacon. And I think we have our first quiz.
All right, this is Jennifer again. Before we get to the quiz, Tim, I want to make sure that you're familiar with our participants. So I'm just going to go through our list of who is attending and what their role is in their experience with Davis-Bacon. So we have Jamie, who is an office manager at FCI Constructors, Inc. Reed McCullough, the executive director of Chafee Housing Trust, just wants to prepare for Davis-Bacon. Brian, who's also with FCI Constructors, he's the general contractor for the Sparrow Apartment Project in Durango. We have, let's see, we have quite a few DOH folks. We have Wayne McClary, Julia Zaffarano, Teresa McCoy. Let's see who else, Stacy Song, Andrew Atchley. We have Teresa Lopez, who is a project coordinator for FCI Constructors. Melissa Nearson with Division of Housing. Hannah with Aurora Housing Authority, Special Projects Manager. Mira, the Asset Services Facilitator with Aurora Housing Authority, who has some familiarity, isn't sure of all the things that count as construction, which we might have just touched on, but let us know if you want further clarification on that. Kathy with Belmont Development. Jen Stapleton with DOH, and Jody Atkins from Division of Housing, the CDBG Program Manager at DLG. And if I missed you, I'm so sorry. I was kind of hopping around between DOH employees and attendees. So back to our pop quiz question. The question is, if I am a foreman on the construction site and I do not perform any construction work, do Davis-Bacon wages apply to me? And so in the chat feature, please respond with your answer, yes or no, and I will let Tim give the final answer.
So what do you think? Do you think we've got everybody?
No, not yet. I think we have a couple yeses, a couple nos. Maybe give folks a minute or so. Reed says no, they're construction management. Okay, we have a couple people saying no. All right, Tim, you want to answer this one?
Okay, so in this particular instance, the answer is no, because the key here is they do not perform any construction work. So they are strictly supervising the laborers for this contractor or subcontractor. So again, if the foreman is a working foreman, at least 20% of the time he is performing work, then he would need to be paid Davis-Bacon wages. Okay. Next slide. So now we're going to assume that a project is going to be funded with HOME dollars, Home Investment Partnership Act dollars. So with HOME, the standard for determining whether Davis-Bacon is going to be triggered is how many home assisted units there are. So it's not what's being financed. With HOME funding, you are assisting a specific number of units. So you're always, if you're assisting those units are always being constructed or something is being done to those units. So in this case, any contract for the construction of affordable housing with 12 or more units that are considered assisted with home or home assisted units, as we often say, that's going to trigger Davis-Bacon. And then once Davis-Bacon is triggered, it does apply to the construction work on the entire project, regardless. I mean, you can say, hey, we're going to use our home funds for acquisition, but as long as there are 12 assisted units or more on the project, you're still going to have to pay Davis-Bacon wages for the construction work being paid for on that project. One little side note is a true group home. So if you're building a group home or rehabbing a group home and maybe it houses 24 people, if it is truly a group home, it is considered one unit. So you wouldn't be triggering Davis-Bacon because you had 24 beds. Okay, next slide. Other triggers that can trigger Davis-Bacon are other types of federal assistance. So vouchers are one of the more common things that will also trigger Davis-Bacon. So if there are going to be 9 or more, and I guess I should use the term project-based housing choice vouchers in the project, and housing choice vouchers are what are commonly referred to in the past as Section 8, that will trigger Davis-Bacon for the project. 9 or more VASH vouchers that are project-based in the project will trigger Davis-Bacon. And 12 or more 811 vouchers that are project-based in the project would trigger Davis-Bacon. The other thing you've got to kind of be careful is you as a community might be putting home dollars into a project, but they might also be coming to the state. And we might be putting home dollars into the project. So you have to be aware that triggers are cumulative in that respect. So if the amount of funding you were putting into the project was going to require you, show that you've got, say, 7 assisted home units and the state's putting in a comparable amount of money and we need 7 assisted home assisted units, that's 14. So that would trigger Davis-Bacon. Individually, our home contribution wouldn't have triggered it, but you do have to work with all the potential funders to make sure you know what kind of money they're putting in. Now, in that example, if you were putting in some of the city's home dollars and the state was using our housing development grant money, HDG state funds, then you wouldn't need to worry. There's only one source of home funds. You're only going to need 7 units. You would not be triggering Davis-Bacon in that particular instance. Next slide.
Sorry, 1 second, Tim. We have a question.
Oh, okay.
Does this mean that Davis-Bacon applies for the future of that project indefinitely? So I think the question is, well.
You mean, so once the project is constructed, so I think what you might be referring to is, let's say 2 years down the road, you need to go in and put a new roof on. No, your project has been completed. So you're not going to be, doing maintenance and repair is not going to trigger Davis-Bacon in the future. Is that the question?
I believe so, Mira. If that doesn't answer your question, just write so. Oh, that does answer the question.
Okay, great. Some of the considerations organizations make, or even the state, we try to keep costs down where we can keep costs down. So, we try to think of ways that we don't have to trigger, more expense for the project. But some of the things you do need to consider when your project is triggering Davis-Bacon is Davis-Bacon wages typically increase costs. Now, right now, that might not necessarily be the case because pretty much contractors are being paid, at or above those rates anyway. The other thing you need to consider is different wage rates apply for different types of construction. So there is a classification of residential and a classification of building. So depending on the size of your building, it can trigger a different type of wage decision and different wage rates that you need to pay, where residential tends to be a little more affordable. The building classification, the wage rates tend to be a little higher. The other thing to consider is your time spent for implementation. So even in a booming economy where maybe the wages themselves aren't necessarily that much higher than what you would pay contractors at this point in time, the contractor is also going to take into account in his bidding, the record keeping, the reporting, filling out his payrolls and complying with all of those. And then you as an agency that might be needing to be the lead agency for Davis-Bacon, you've got that time doing the same thing, reviewing those payrolls, doing the reports to HUD and monitoring, doing interviews. So those are some of the considerations you've got to think of when considering if a project is going to trigger Davis-Bacon. Oh, I think we have a quiz again already.
Before we hop into that quiz, Melissa raised her hand. Melissa, do we want to unmute you, or do you want to add your question in our chat? Oh, oh, it was an accident. So let's go ahead and move forward with with the pop quiz.
Okay.
Okay, so our pop quiz question number 2, which of these would trigger Davis-Bacon? Option A, 8 home-assisted units from DOH and 4 home-assisted units from the local housing authority. B, 11 VASH vouchers. C, paying for construction financing with CDBG. D, all of the above. Or E, none of the above. We'll give folks a couple minutes to answer that. Getting D, all of the above. We have A. Few more people saying D, all of the above. All right, let's give them a minute because we've only gotten maybe 8 responses. Okay. All right. Looks like we can move forward.
Okay.
Tim, do you want to provide the answer to this one?
I noticed a lot of people right. D, it's all of the above. So in answer A, it's cumulative. So you had 8 home-assisted units from DOH and 4 from the local housing authority. That's 12. So 12 or more home-assisted units will trigger Davis-Bacon. VASH vouchers, with VASH vouchers, it's 9 or more, and we had 11 VASH vouchers, so that would have triggered it. And again, if it was funded with CDBG, paying for construction will always trigger Davis-Bacon. So D, all of the above. Very good. So now we get into the good stuff. So implementation and compliance. So you've triggered Davis-Bacon. Now what do you do? What I like to consider the first step is determine the lead agency. That's especially in the case of multiple funders that might have helped trigger the Davis-Bacon. So a lead agency must be a governmental or quasi-governmental entity. So the city, county, state, quasi-governmental entity would be like a housing authority. So any of those entities can be a lead agency. The contractor can't be, the lead entity in a situation like this. The lead agency is going to be the main point of contact for implementation and compliance. So it is the lead agency that should be the only one pulling the wage decisions and making the final application for a new wage classification, that kind of thing. Lead agency should be involved very, very early in the process, because if the project goes out to bid, for example, without having the proper language in, informing bidders that it is a Davis-Bacon project, and the sample wage decision in with that process, it can really put the project at risk of the funding source that might be triggering this. I think we can go to the next slide.
Well, before we do that, Wayne has a question.
Okay.
Does the lead agency need to be involved in the funding of the project? In other words, does it matter if the lead agency is not triggering Davis-Bacon?
Well, there probably are instances like if DOH didn't trigger the need for it to be Davis-Bacon, but we are, funding the project, and the agency that did trigger it maybe doesn't have capacity, it would be a point of discussion that we might, get involved in that point. I guess some of the ways that we might determine who the lead agency is, or normally what we do is number one, who triggered it. So if DOH was putting some state funding into the project, but the housing authority put 10 vouchers in and thus triggered the Davis-Bacon, we would tend to expect the housing authority to be the lead agency. We did have a situation where there were a couple of projects going up in a community where both the local housing authority and DOH each provided an equal number of vouchers to each project. So in that particular instance, we split it. DOH was the lead agency on one of the projects, and the housing authority was the lead agency on the other project. So it is kind of a negotiation process, so to speak, but typically it's, who triggered it, and if two people triggered it, who maybe put more money in or more vouchers in. But again, it's up to discussion, based on capacity and whether, if it's a small rural area and they've never, a community has never managed a Davis-Bacon project before, it might be better that DOH assist with that. Okay. So in a Davis-Bacon project, there are technically 4 categories of wage decision for Davis-Bacon. They're residential, building, heavy, and highway. And as far as what we're going to deal with, DOH isn't going to fund a highway. So we're always going to be dealing with the residential or building classification. And basically what you have is a residential classification are for your typical, say, apartment multifamily building that's 4 stories or less. Once you go to 5 stories or more, you're going to be in the little higher priced wage category under the building classification. Next step, you need to pull the proper wage determination, and that should be included within any bid documents. I typically am going to mark it as sample because the wages could change, over the course of the bidding process. It should always be the lead agency. You don't want several different people pulling wage decisions, so or wage determinations. So you'll want to make sure that the lead agency now is the single point of contact for all of that. You get the wage determinations online at www.wdol.gov. Just need to make sure you use the proper category and proper location of the project when getting that wage determination.
Tim, we have a question.
Okay.
What about resurfacing a parking lot or a federally funded multifamily housing community?
A federally funded multifamily housing community. I tell you, this would probably get way into the weeds, and I don't particularly remember what that percentage is, but If you are building a multifamily project and you're putting in a parking lot, one might think that's highway, but you typically don't. I mean, it would still be a residential project. Now, if the project has a lot of components, or a lot of it would be considered highway or heavy, and only a part of it is residential, there are cases where you would actually work with two different wage decisions for the two different portions of the project. But again, as far as what we at DOH would ever really be funding, I don't think that would ever be the case. Did that, let me see, was there another part of that question, or?
I believe you answered it.
Okay. Okay, let me see. Yeah, so use proper category and location of the project. Okay, I think we can go on to the next slide.
Mira says, in the weeds, that's where I live. Thanks. And Mira,
yeah, and again, I just don't think that anything that we would be involved with would ever, to my knowledge, we've never been involved in a project that you would ever work with different two different wage decisions. So.
And Mira, you can work with your asset manager or your housing development specialist for those situations as well.
Correct. Yep. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide.
We actually have one more question.
Oh, okay.
From Teresa Lopez. It says, in the past, I was always told the official wage determination should be pulled by the DOL to make sure the project is using the accurate one. Is this not the case?
No, it should be able to be pulled by like, this is why it's important that whoever the lead agency on the project is the one that pulls it. I've run into that situation where somebody else had pulled one and they were not the same mod number. They were not the official locked in wage decision. So we will be talking about locking in the wage decision later, but it should be pulled by whoever is serving as the lead agency on this project. Again, we've kind of talked about this in making sure that the Davis-Bacon requirements are a part of the bid package. I have talked about making sure the wage determination is in there in the proper language, but there are a couple other things that should be in the bid document also. There's the labor standard provisions. It's HUD form 4010. And again, that's like 4 pages of language or something, but you really should make sure that all of these items are in the bid package. And as I'd mentioned before, I just always on the wage decision that went into the bid package, I used to market sample. And a little later on, we'll talk about how you determine what the final wage decision is in the project. Just to let you know too, these HUD forms I'm talking about, at the end of the presentation, I've got a link that takes you to a great page that has all of the HUD forms, you know, the payroll forms, this form, pretty much everything that you would need for your Davis-Bacon project. So next slide. So as I'd mentioned, so you might have put a sample wage decision in the bid package. So what you'll want to do is put on your calendar 10 days before the bid opening, you'll want to go in and see if there's been any kind of a new modification to the wage decision. And they do label the modification numbers. So the one you pull might be mod 1. So now if you pull one 10 days before and it's mod 2, you know there's been some kind of a change to that wage decision. You'll want to have some kind of mechanism to make sure the bidding contractors have access to now that new modified wage decision. But in essence, you can lock in your Davis-Bacon wages 10 days prior to the bid opening, and that's provided you're going to award the contract within 90 days. But anyway, that will give the contractors kind of a last chance to look at the wage decision. when those mods come out, boy, I've really strained my eyes trying to find out where the changes are. It's usually, one or two, minor little items, but you will want to make sure that you have presented that to the contractors. Another thing you're going to want to do is try as soon as possible to determine if there are any missing labor classifications on the wage decision. This has always been a sore point for me. It's very common that there'll be missing classifications, even in urban areas, but a wage determination in a less urban area, I mean, there's almost nothing on it. I don't know how contractors are expected to bid on a project like that. The problem is you're not allowed to formally request new classifications until it's under contract. So it's really a good idea to try to at least identify the missing classifications up front, so that as soon as possible you can start requesting those classifications after contract. Just another point, if there is no official bid opening, that usually occurs in a CDBG contract kind of situation, then our thought is that you'll want to lock it in at the time of award. And if there was no official award, then lock it in at the time of contract. I will say, and I don't think many people do this, when I was with the city of Aurora, I never thought it was very fair for contractors to have to bid when their classification wasn't in the wage decision. So I would do a little research. You can't use a classification off of another wage decision, but I would try to determine a basis for the bidding. So I might say, if there was no painter on the classification, I might say, hey, if they came and asked me saying, hey, this is a missing classification, I might tell them, hey, why don't you bid a painter at this? And then at the city, we would use that as a basis for a potential change order in the future. So if we told them to bid it at $26 an hour, and then after the contract they went and requested the wage classification and it came back at $35 an hour, I wouldn't expect them to absorb that. So we would actually use that as a basis for doing a change order. Just to let you know, not knowing how long this was actually going to take and who was actually going to be present here, I do have some examples of wage decisions that after the slideshow, for people who want to stay on, we can go through some of those wage decisions. I've got an example of one in an urban area and one in a non-urban area. So if you do want to get into a little more detail of the wage decisions, we can go through those a little later on.
Tim, there's a question for you.
Okay.
Melissa says, we generally don't execute the guaranteed maximum contract with the GC until many months/years after the award of the bid. Can we lock in at the time of the award, or do we need to update prior to the execution of the GMP?
Yeah, you will need to update. Again, you would, I have never ever really found, I found the part about, the contract needs to be awarded within 90 days. Well, there is a difference between an award and an execution. And I know Jody is on here, so I don't know if she, can weigh in on that. But if you're not going to execute the contract in a timely period, you're probably going to have to lock it in at the time of your contract execution.
We also have, Jody, I did give you the ability to talk, if you want to add anything to that. But we also had a question of more examples of missing labor classifications or the additional wage classification, what that looks like.
I'm sorry, so.
You want to, Tim, go ahead and with the missing wage classification.
I guess I don't understand.
Can Tim talk a little more about missing labor classifications, like an example? So maybe something you've come across. You gave the painter example. Can you
Oh,
provide one more?
yeah. When I was with the city of Aurora, I mean, we're a pretty urban area, but many times there wouldn't even be a roofer on the wage determination. Um, when you get into a rural area, there are just so few. And again, I do have a couple of samples of those that at the end, for people who can stay on, we can actually pull those up on the screen and kind of show you the difference between missing classifications. But I don't think I've ever served as the lead on a Davis-Bacon project where, even in urban areas, where we haven't had to request classifications, because you'll like elevators, for instance, those are very seldom on any kind of a wage determination. Sometimes some types of construction equipment are missing. There's just, you will find a lot of missing classifications, I'm afraid.
And Tim, so if you're having a missing classification, who do you send that additional wage classification to?
We've got that coming up.
Great. Jody?
Actually, I'll just quickly say that my understanding is that the wage decision isn't based on execution of a contract, it's based on award. So if this was negotiated or a non-closed bid, or not a bid situation, then it has to be within the wages stand as long as the award is made within 90 days. Is that your understanding, Tim?
Well, yeah, but the question earlier was, so what if they've made an award, but what if they don't actually contract for a year?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I've only ever found in the regs the mention of award.
Yes.
It's
and
never said anything about the contract. And
Yes.
I mean, common sense tells me, no, you can't, lock in wages a year prior to when you actually are going to contract. But I've never come across a date. I mean, other than the fact that, you just.
The award date is the only thing they mention. And so I would agree with you. Common sense would take me to that conclusion. But I find that sometimes common sense isn't involved in some of these things.
Right.
So I would go by the language that they say. And I think that's something that maybe you and I can follow up on to make a clear, make it clear for everybody of any guidance that is contrary to, has to be awarded within 90 days. And maybe we can get that out to people.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks.
And Melissa followed up with that comment to say, for safety's sake, we update the wage determination prior to the execution of the GMP.
That would be my recommendation. I mean, I'm just always very cautious because, if HUD comes out to monitor, I always err on the more cautious side than than not, just to make sure we don't have any findings, I guess. I think it's quiz time if no other questions.
All right, so pop quiz number 3. Question is, how many days before bid opening can the wage determination be locked in? A, 15, B, 30, C, 10, or D, 365? Let's give folks maybe a couple minutes here, and then I'll have Tim give the answer. Got a couple C's. We have 1A. Looks like people are really thinking about this one. Couple more C's. C's. Tim, what's the answer?
It is C, and I think most people got that.
Melissa says, the slides, I think the slide said C, but really, if it's changing all the time, you might just want to say, hey, whatever it is on the award date.
Probably a good idea. This question is assuming that everything is going normally, that you're going to, award it within 90 days and after bid opening, and hopefully do your contract shortly after that. But okay.
I believe. Okay, so I think next we're going to talk about missing labor classification. So I'll let you take it back.
Okay, great. So as we talked about, the wage determinations often are missing classifications. Again, to just reiterate, it should be done as soon after contract as possible. One thing that can definitely happen during the course of this is you're missing the roofer classification, and then the roofer starts working on it. He doesn't know what to pay his people. Well, getting the wage classification back from the Department of Labor sometimes can take a little time. So he's going to go ahead and pay his roofers, and then when the classification comes back and he didn't pay them enough, now you have to go back and do the paperwork to do the restitution. So that's why, even though the roofer may not be starting for quite some time, I would still not wait to get those extra classification requests in. So what you need to do is, usually the contractor or the subcontractor who is going to need that classification should, on their letterhead, prepare the request, and in that request they should be proposing the wage rate and the fringe benefit amount that they want to pay or think is normal in the area. The lead agency is going to need to submit that letter along with HUD Form 4230A, which they'll fill out, and a copy of the locked-in wage decision on that project. Now, most people are going to submit it to HUD Labor Relations staff. The state submits it directly to DOL. So if the state is the lead agency and you get that information to us, we're going to submit it to DOL. But if you're a housing authority or now it's been a while since I've done this, so I'm assuming that it's still that's the case, that you're going to submit it to the HUD office for labor relations in your region. Next. Let me make sure I got all my notes here. Oh, I tell you what, we can go back for a minute. A while back, HUD kind of attended a CDBG users group meeting where they'd indicated that the number of requests that Department of Labor gets on wage classifications has kind of gotten way out of hand, and did indicate that you should use a little judgment in terms of whether the classification you're requesting might not fit into another classification on the wage determination. I guess I kind of use an example, and again, it depends on what you might know about construction, but I like to use an example. I don't know if you've all seen that piece of equipment. It kind of looks like a big tractor, and on the front there's a big wide scoop down low, and on the back there's a big arm, and comes down with a bucket. If you're looking at the back part of that piece of equipment, that's a backhoe. If you're looking at the front piece of that equipment, it's a front end loader. I've seen wage determinations that have a backhoe classification, but no front end loader, or vice versa, a front end loader, but no backhoe. It's the same piece of equipment. So, if you've got somebody that needed a front end loader classification and there is a backhoe classification on there, I think you're safe in using the backhoe. So again, depends on your knowledge of construction and equipment and what have you, but if you do feel that you can make a case that an existing classification on the wage determination, would fit, use it. If you're not sure, probably best to request a classification. When you do request those classifications, you know, the contractor is going to submit his letter and he's going to say he wants to pay this wage rate plus this fringe. When that gets submitted to finally to the Department of Labor, they're going to either accept the contractor's request or they're going to reject it. If they reject it, then they are going to then send you that determination, that classification and wage rate that you're going to need to pay on that project.
Tim, we have a question, Tim.
Okay.
Do you have to anticipate all the labor classifications that might be missing? How long do missing classification wage decisions take?
They're supposed to be done within 30 days. Do they always get back within 30 days? And I'm pretty sure Jody can, you know, attest to that. They don't always come back in 30 days. And again, that's why I'm saying it is best practice to try to determine those missing classifications up front and ask for them as soon as possible. Because again, it can delay, well, it can't delay the laborers being paid, but you may end up paying the wrong wage rate and then having to go back and make restitution. So if you do not get those requested early, you could end up in that situation. One other thing I do, want to mention too is Department of Labor's method for determining rates. It takes into consideration the sources of the majority of the wages they have on the initial determination. So when they send out their surveys to contractors to try to request, what are common wages in the area, if most of those wages are determined off of just, standard non-union type of contractors that submit, then your wage decision might come back, or your new wage classification would probably come back at a little bit of a lower rate. If the majority of the wages that were determined on the wage determination are from those union sources, which, the wages tend to be higher, then even though it's a non-union contractor that's requesting that wage classification, the wages are probably going to be closer to union wages when they come back. I think that is all my notes on that one. Okay, we're already on the next slide, it looks like. So another thing, you've got to make sure that in addition to posting the wage determination on the job site, as you request any wage classifications, when those come back, those need to be posted on the job site. And there's also labor posters that also must be located on the project site. I mentioned earlier, but laborers must be paid weekly, and the certified payrolls are supposed to be submitted weekly. And good luck if that ever happens, but they're supposed to be. I always encourage somebody who's acting as the lead on this to review those payrolls weekly, simply because if you put them in a stack and wait, and then you find there's an issue and somebody's underpaying, then there's a lot more involved in getting those restitution payments, where if you make it a point to take the time to review weekly, you're going to catch anything early and not cause a laborer to wait 3 months to get their pay that they were due. When you're reviewing the payrolls, you're looking at hours, wages, and overtime to make sure they're all paid correctly, making sure the fringe benefits are paid correctly. Are apprentices properly classified or certified? An apprentice, you cannot just call somebody an apprentice. An apprentice has to be enrolled in a legitimate apprenticeship program. Is the form completed and signed? If there isn't an underpayment, you need to make sure that you inform the contractors and get the laborers paid that restitution. The other thing, you get people making up their own classifications. So, make sure that the contractors are using classifications as they appear on the wage decision or on the additional wage classification. So you're going to have classifications usually for drywall hanger and drywall finisher. Don't let somebody use a drywall screwer. People will, they try to put down exactly what the person, is doing. When you're screwing on the drywall, you're hanging the drywall. So just try to make sure that they know to use an actual classification. And again, if they've got something that isn't on the wage decision, then you might need to request that additional classification. Also, when you're hanging the posters on the job site, whoever is going to be the kind of lead person, the state, it would more than likely be the asset manager, that their contact information should be on that labor poster. So if there is a laborer that's there and he thinks he's being underpaid, we want to make sure they know how they can contact us to let us know that that's potentially a problem. The other thing, I always hate it when they do, but contractors can use their own payroll report form instead of the 347 or whatever the number is, but it does need to contain all the same information. But some contractors do like to, use their own computer and payroll system and be able to produce it electronically. So it just needs to contain all the same information. Yeah, I've got a lot of side notes on this. When you're trying to determine wages, when you're on the wage determination, you might see that the wage is $11 and the fringe is $3. So the combination has to add up to $14, and it can be any combination. So again, if you don't provide any fringe benefits or the subcontractor doesn't provide any fringe benefits, then he needs to be paying $14 an hour. If the value of the contractor's supplied fringe is actually $4, then again, the pay can be $10, the fringe can be $4, even though on the wage decision it says $11. So the combination of the two have to add up to the combination of the two on the wage decision. The other thing about overtime, overtime must be paid. And you're probably never going to run into this. I mean, almost everybody pays time and a half for overtime, and they pay time and a half on the salary they're paying. But Davis-Bacon only requires, this is hard, you kind of get into examples, but again, if somebody's using round number, is making, if the wage decision says they need to make $10 an hour, then of course time and a half would be $15 an hour. If they're actually in real life making $11 an hour, the amount of overtime only has to be on that $10 an hour. Again, I don't think you're ever going to find anybody that would ever not pay somebody the time and a half on what their actual wage is, but technically that's the case on the overtime. The other thing you got to be careful of too is on the front page of the wage decision, you're going to find an absolute minimum wage. And I think right now that's something like $10.60 or $10.80. When you go looking through the wage decision, one of the examples I have that I can show later on if people want to stay is a common laborer's wage rate on the wage decision is $10.33. Why they put that $10.33 on there, I don't know, because you have to pay the $10.60 or the $10.80, whatever that is. So you've got to be careful that on some of the lower wage classifications that there aren't some that are actually lower than the minimum you can pay based on what's appearing on the first page of the wage decision. Make sure I got all my notes on this one. This was a good one. Oh, fringe benefits. So you've got to also be very careful about this because you'll get some employers that think that, the Social Security they pay, or the required payments they have to deduct from a paycheck is a fringe benefit, and that's not the case. It's employer paid again, they might provide insurance, but they deduct an amount from your check to pay for the insurance. It can only be what the employer pays. So yes, if you get 2 weeks vacation, the employer can figure out what that value of that is because that is something the employer is paying out of their pocket. You may have insurance that the employer pays, or maybe they pay a part of it. So when determining their fringe benefit, they can only calculate the portion that they're paying, not what you're also paying. So hopefully that's understandable. But yeah, Social Security, unemployment, workers' comp insurance, even though they're paying that, that's something they're required to do anyway. So that is not a fringe benefit. I do kind of always like to give this example of repercussions of payrolls not being submitted in a timely manner. I personally had a project where the electrician was not, they'd hired some people right out of a trade school, and so they were classifying them as apprentices. They did not submit their payrolls for probably 20 weeks. And when the payrolls got submitted, I saw that there were apprentices on the payroll. I asked for their enrollment in the apprenticeship program information. They hadn't enrolled them in an apprenticeship program. Now, the first payroll came in with like an apprentice at 4 hours. And then they didn't use apprentices for like another 3 weeks. So had they turned in the payrolls on a weekly basis like they were supposed to, we would have caught the situation that they thought these apprentices were really apprentices and they weren't. But what resulted, because so many payrolls had gone by, these 3 people that were classified as apprentices that were not enrolled in an apprenticeship program all had to be paid electrician wages, and it came to over $11,000. So that's another reason to try to encourage subcontractors to submit their payrolls weekly, because it can't be caught until the payrolls are received. I did see something pop up in a chat, but I didn't see it. Is there a question or?
There is a question. What's the timeline for a contractor to pay restitution? And more specifically, is it the lead agency's responsibility for tracking those restitution payments?
As a lead agency, you don't necessarily have to require like proof unless you're suspicious of something, but the lead agency, the contractor has to submit the revised payroll showing that restitution has been paid. As far as timeline, we can't disperse final payment until Davis-Bacon can be signed off on. So I don't know that there's anything that says they have to pay that within the next week or not. Obviously they should, but if they don't, we're not going to issue the final payment of home funds or whatever we've got in the project until everything is settled. Hopefully that got the question answered.
I think it did. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide. Another part of implementing Davis-Bacon is conducting on-site interviews. HUD has a form, it's HUD 11, and they have it available in both English and Spanish. Again, at the end of this slideshow is that link to all the HUD forms. Interviews should be confidential. I mean, you shouldn't really be asking people what they make, next to somebody else. So if you are in a group of people, you might want to try to pull them aside. Might want to get them away from their supervisor too. They should be feeling really comfortable and free to answer the questions. And the interviews should be representative of the contractors and different subcontractors that are on the site. That being said, if you ask HUD how many interviews you should be doing, they say 20% of the employees of each trade. You could never possibly ever do that, especially if you're the state and you've got a project in Durango. I mean, how often could you get down there to actually do the interviews? You have some subcontractors that might only be on site for a day. So I'm going to tell you what HUD says, but I'm going to tell you that you probably aren't going to be able to accomplish that. You know, my rule of thumb is whenever I would go on site, I would try to go on site at least monthly. And I would try to make sure I interviewed somebody from every sub that was on the site that day. But anyway, the idea is you should be trying to get a good representation of everybody that's on the site. Now you've done the interview, so what do you do with it? So you've got the interview back in your file. You know what day you did the interviews. So now your certified payrolls are going to come in. And so the purpose of these interviews is for you to compare those to the certified payrolls when they come in. So if the individual you interviewed said he was a bricklayer, and when the payroll comes in, it's showing him as a brick tender and, you know, making a lot less money than what a bricklayer would have been, you're going to question that, and you're going to try to figure out what the problem is and making sure that who's right, the contractor or the employee. Again, a lot of times people don't even know what they're making, but you know, hopefully they've told you what they're making, and you're going to compare that with the payroll that came and make sure that the pay is matching. And then the biggie is I've had payrolls come in. I interviewed a person on July 5th, and on the payroll, it's not even showing that he worked on July 5th. So again, you're looking for discrepancies between the payroll and the interview you conducted. Another responsibility of the agency is to file the semi-annual enforcement reports. Again, HUD Form 4710. Those get done twice a year, and one is for the period October 1st through March 31st, and the second is the period April 1st through September 30th. So again, you can look at an example of the reports, you know, what it's asking for, but the gist there is you're going to keep track of all the enforcement actions you had to take, you know, any payroll discrepancies you had that required the contractor to reimburse their employees, and you're going to report those all on these semi-annual reports. Good idea. Oh, I also always like, it's really a good idea to let the contractors know, you know, let them tell their people that, hey, somebody could be coming on site. It's okay to talk to them. You do get people that just aren't sure what this is. I always kind of start the conversation, hey, I've just got to ask you a few questions, and basically why I'm here is to make sure you're getting paid as much as you're supposed to. And then they're usually, you know, open to talk to you. But if the contractors can let their laborers know that this is going to happen, and you know, it's nothing they need to worry about, that always makes things just a little bit better. Again, when I go to do the interviews, that's a good time to check to make sure that they have the wage decision and the labor posters and stuff hanging on site. Those should be there. Another thing that I've, you know, learned with experience is I keep a running total of your reimbursements and things that are going to have to go on the semi-annual enforcement report. Nothing worse than going to have to fill that out, and then you have to go through all of your payrolls to see what your enforcement actions were. So maybe keep another little paper in your file that, you know, lets you know that XYZ contractor, you know, had some underpayment, and you know, write down, you know, look at that enforcement report to know what you need to keep track of, and keep track of that in advance. I think we can go to the next slide. So maintain the Davis-Bacon project files. I won't even tell you what the technical number of years are, because HUD recommends 5 years. So if they recommend 5 years, you better keep them 5 years. We actually recommend 6 years. What should your Davis-Bacon files contain? So again, everybody is different on how they organize their files, but I just always, in my first tabs, I always had the wage decision, any additional classifications, including the requests, then I always kept my certified payrolls. I tried to do them like in alphabetical order and keep a little tab in there per subcontractors because it just keeps on growing during the course of the project. Any correspondence you had. So, you know, if you've found situations of underpayment or something, you're going to want to have that correspondence in there. The enforcement reports that you do and turn in. Also, you'll want some basic project information. So you will want a copy of the bid documents to show that you did review those and that the Davis-Bacon language was included. You're going to want to somehow record relevant dates, the bid opening, the award, the contract date. And then you should keep some kind of final completion or payment notice that, yes, you know, you've signed off on the Davis-Bacon, it's complete, it's okay to make that final payment. I think we can go to the next slide. And guess what? It's quiz time.
All right, so pop quiz question number 4. The wage rate on a wage decision is $10 an hour. The fringe rate is $5 an hour. And the contractor is paying $9 an hour with the fringe rate at $6 an hour. Can the contractor do this? The answers are A, yes, B, no, or C, I don't know. All right. Oh, okay, we have a few yeses. Let's see. Okay, a couple B's, couple A's. Just got a few more yeses. All right, Tim, what is the answer?
Okay, the answer is yes, they can. Again, it can be any combination that adds up to the wage and fringe as listed on the wage decision. So in this case, the wage decision was $10 an hour plus $5 an hour fringe, which totals 15. So now the contractor's paying 9, but his fringe is worth 6. That still adds up to 15. So that is acceptable. Okay, so these are some of the resources available to you with links. So yeah, again, getting or pulling wage determinations, there's the link. That second link is the good one. That one has almost all the Davis-Bacon and labor standard forms you're ever going to need. There is the third link is a really good aid for learning how to fill out a payroll. So I just included that one in there for that purpose. Next slide. There are some guides that are available, which are just kind of little mini guides for Davis-Bacon, which are very helpful sometimes. There's Making Davis Work, a contractor's guide, so one that's good for contractors. And then there's a Making Davis-Bacon Work for basically local agencies, state and tribes. I believe on our next slide, it's our current assignment map for your asset managers. Again, the asset managers are going to, if the state is serving as the lead agency, your asset manager is who's going to primarily be doing the Davis-Bacon or taking the lead on the Davis-Bacon. Again, a little bit of warning that I think these are going to be changing. So you'll always want to go to the website to get the most current map to make sure. Again, if the next one is the location map for the various development specialists. And again, the development specialist is who you work with usually in the beginning of a new project. So again, you are going to want to work with your development specialist also in terms of what's going on there. And that one is definitely going to be changing in a couple of months because I'm retiring. So make sure that you do pull a current one in the future to make sure you're contacting the right individual there. So I guess for this part, are there any other kind of questions hanging out there? Wayne said he goes get out when it gets complicated.
Exactly. So think if you want to show the documents, I don't see any questions coming in at the moment.
Okay. The next slide is just, it's Ariel and Jennifer's contact information. Again, Dean, I've got maybe 7 weeks left. We didn't put me on there. You can still reach me, if you need to in the next few weeks, but thought it'd be best to leave people on these slides that you might print off that might actually be there someday when you contact them. Okay. For those who want to stay, I was going to look at a couple of different wage decisions to show you the difference between a rural wage decision and a more urban wage decision. And then I also have that we can display that kind of how to fill out a payroll. So if anybody wants to stay on, we'll see how many people stay. I guess you can go ahead. Why don't you put up the non-urban wage decision?
And as Ariel is pulling that up, we did get a couple questions.
Oh, okay.
First question, what if the wage classifications are lower than you are paying your employees? Do you fill out the certified payroll with their pay?
No, if you can always pay more. Yeah, it's just you cannot pay less.
And the other question is, if we used home funds for a community and the project is complete, but later on we do some work that qualifies as construction because we have, say, 10 project-based vouchers or VASH units, does every construction-based project on that property count as Davis-Bacon?
Boy, I think that's going to be a case-by-case situation. I think, as you mentioned in your second example, you've got 10 project-based vouchers. You mean you've already built? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. If you've already built a project and now you're coming and you're building another project and the second project triggers Davis-Bacon, no, you don't go back on first project and pay Davis-Bacon wages. Vice versa, you can't bifurcate contracts to avoid Davis-Bacon either. So if you're doing a project, and you're dividing contracts so that this building's being built by one contractor and this building's being built by another contractor, and individually those two contracts, the home assisted units or whatever you're paying for wouldn't trigger Davis-Bacon, but one of them would. You better pay Davis-Bacon. Don't know if that captures what you were asking, but it does kind of get into the weeds again, and that's where you would want to work with your development specialist or the asset manager to determine what your project is and whether it's going to trigger it or not.
I think we are ready to move on to these forms.
Okay, so what has been posted is a wage decision, and you can see the counties. So in other words, if you would have punched in Archuleta County, this is a wage decision that would have come up, and it lists a whole bunch of counties. But these tend to be more non-urban counties. So if you go down to where it says note, so yeah, it says residential construction, then it says note. It says under executive order, whatever, an hourly minimum wage of $10.80 for calendar year 2020 applies. So this is what a lot of people miss. So there is a minimum wage. You can't pay less than $10.80. So if you arrow down on this, go down to the common laborer, I think is the one that I noticed. Yeah, so see, under laborers, common, the rate's 1033, no fringe. So I'm not even sure why that 1033 appears on there, because you cannot pay less than 1080. So you do have to be careful. You're only going to usually find this in some of the lower wage classifications, but you need to be sure that you're paying the 1080 and not the 1033, even though this says the rate is 1033. But as you can see from this wage decision, so we've got a carpenter, we got laborer, we got painter, we got plumber. They pretty much, you know, there's usually several electricians. If you want to go back up now, let's go back up to the start. I just wanted to use that as an example. Okay, go just up a little bit. I was going to show the mod number, and so go. I'm sorry, I said up. I meant down. Okay, up a little. Up a little more. Up a little more. So where it says modification number, so this particular one has had, well, technically two modifications, mod number 0 and mod number 1. So when you put it out to bid, the one you pulled might have been the modification 0, you know, which the publication date was 1/3/2020. But if you gave your contractors 30 days to bid, then another modification would have taken place. So that's why I always mark that decision I'm putting in the bid documents as sample, and then I put on my calendar to make sure that I'm pulling a new one to make sure there's not another modification prior to the bid opening. So in this particular case, there would have been a new wage decision out between the time you might have put it out to bid and that. Now, if you go down to the top of the next page, okay, so see the very first thing at the top is the electrician. You see a dotted line under that electrician. Actually, in this particular case, the counties that wage rate for appeared on the first page. And then there's a dotted line. Yeah, so that rate is for all of those counties. Now there's a dotted line. Now they're listing another group of counties. And so the wage rate below those would be the electrician's wage rate in those counties. So you always want to look between the dotted lines. Now arrow up slightly, keep on going. There's almost always several electrician wages, but just be aware that they're between the dotted lines or what you want to look for. Boy, a lot of electricians. So now after the last electrician, there's a dotted line, and then there's an iron worker and a dotted line. So now there's no counties listed between those dotted lines. So that iron worker classification is for all counties that were in the very, very top of this classification. And then again, there's another dotted line, and then that lists carpenter, laborer, painter, plumber. Again, because there are no counties listed within those dotted lines, it is for all the counties that appear at the very top of this classification. So I think now, just to use as an example, so you've seen, so basically we had electrician, we have iron worker, we have carpenter, laborer, painter, and plumber. And I'm pretty sure that's about all that's on this wage decision. So if we go to the urban wage decision, and again, this one, I think I punched in Denver County, but it's Adams County, Denver County, Boulder, Broomfield, Jefferson, El Paso. So in other words, even though I pulled Denver, it's for all of the counties listed here. And the one exception to that is going to be if in between those dotted lines, they may have specified, you know, certain counties. So again, here, so for Adams, Arapahoe, Boulder, Broomfield, Denver, Douglas, and Jefferson counties, there's the bricklayer rate. Now there's a dotted line. So now we're going into all of those electricians again. There's usually an electrician rate for several different areas, but yeah, if we just want to, yeah, just go down here and look down. Now see here, see we're in an urban area, so we have all the power equipment operators. Again, between the dotted lines, there's no specific county listed, so that means it's for all the counties that this wage decision was pulled for. But if you notice on the non-urban county, there was no bulldozer, no motor grader, no, you know, all of those power equipment operator categories were missing. Go up a little more. So there's the iron worker. We have glazer, so people who actually install glass panels, into frameworks. In this particular instance, there was plumber on the other one that counted for all counties. Here we have some plumbers that are county specific, so there's differences there. Yeah, you can just keep. We have pipe fitter. We have go up to some new classifications. Yeah, so pipe fitter didn't appear in the last one. Here we've got carpenter, we've got your cement mason, some concrete finisher, we've got drywall. So there were no drywallers on that non-urban classification. Keep on going up. Painter, see, roofer is on this classification. That wasn't on the last classification. There was no sheet metal worker. There was no sprinkler fitter on the last classification. So you can kind of see that in the non-urban areas, you're going to be missing a lot of classifications. I mean, you're going to be missing some on the urban classifications, but the non-urban is virtually void of anything. And I don't know how to tell you that it isn't easy, but unfortunately, that's why it's important to try to determine what is missing and what you're going to need early on. So as soon as the contract is executed, you can start requesting those classifications. So on the wage decisions, any questions, or did I confuse you more?
So there is a little confusion here. So for Andrew's question, is this a wage determination? Yes, this is. Whereas if you were requesting an additional wage classification, that is
right.
Typically a letter from Department of Labor, usually on their letterhead saying what that specific classification is. And Tim, we do have 2 questions here, or 3 now. What does it mean if a wage rate is not accompanied with a fringe rate? Does that mean it's a less important job?
No, I mean, you'll find a lot of those. Normally, your fringe rates usually end up being on, when they've submitted the surveys to try to find this out, it's usually dealing with more your union type labor classifications. But if there is no fringe rate, it just means the total needs. So under laborers, the brick finisher tender, $11.25 an hour, there is no fringe rate. That just means that he needs to make $11.25 an hour. You can pay fringe, so you could pay him, $10. Well, you couldn't pay him less than $10.80, I guess, on this one. But if you've got fringe, you can count fringe, but it just means on any of these, it just means, so on the form builder, form setter, 1278 plus 198 is the total they need to be making. Whether it's fringe, whether it's not fringe, if they don't pay any fringe benefit of any kind, then it needs to be the 1278 plus the 198. So yeah, if there is no fringe, that's just the total.
Okay. Another question. When I did my Davis-Bacon interviews, I had a couple of undocumented workers. What documentation is needed?
The interview form does ask for, does have a place to ask for the driver's license or something. Very few people working out on the site have those with them. So yeah, I mean, we're not there to determine whether they're legal or not. In this particular instance, we're there to make sure they're making enough money. And that is a sad thing, because I showed up on a construction site one time, and there were probably about 7 or 8 people working. And I went to go find, the foreman or the supervisor on the site to let them know that I was there and I was going to do interviews. And then when I turn around, there's like 3 people on the site. So people don't understand what this is, and they see this person pull up and, well, I had a city car, with an emblem on it, and I get out with this clipboard. They thought I was somebody else probably, but that does happen. But we don't need, for a Davis-Bacon interview, you don't need to determine their status.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Andrew.
So, going back to the rural wage determination or whatever it is. So if I'm FCI and I'm doing a project in La Plata County, and that's the wage determination that's pulled, and there's like, what, 5 things on there. I basically have to like anticipate all of the classifications are going to be on that job and request what, you know, like missing wage determinations kind of before. Is that right? Is that what I'm getting?
Well, you can't make the request until after contract.
Okay. But so,
And
but
see,
you
that's
still,
what to me is just so stupid. You know, how do you bid a project like this? I mean, that's been one of my biggest frustrations. I was a contractor, so I would look
Sure.
at something like this and say, I can't bid this, you know?
Right.
But the problem is you cannot request missing classifications until after contract. So again, that's why I'm just stressing that as soon as you're under contract, the contractor, for their own sanity, you know, should look through here as to what's missing. And now it is like most general contractors, I mean, yeah, they have a little labor on the site, but they're using subcontractors. So he needs to go to his, in this case, roofer, and say, hey, listen, you know, we need to request this classification now, because the roofer is technically the one that needs to make that request on their letterhead. So the general contractor really needs to go to all the subcontractors he's going to use that he doesn't feel can fit into any of these classifications on here, and have them start making those requests immediately. Otherwise, it's just going to be a total headache when it comes time to pay these people and you haven't requested the classification yet.
I'm not gonna lie, this does not seem well thought out.
No, it isn't. And I'm only the messenger.
Right. I'm muting myself now.
I agree with you 100% and always have. That's why when I worked for the city of Aurora, I didn't think this was fair. So I would actually, you know, ask contractors if there's any classifications they feel are missing and that they would want. And I would go to another classification and try to find a wage rate. And, you know, I can't say that is going to be the wage rate. It's done on a 1-by-1 basis. But I used to give the contractors a base wage for which to bid. And then if the wage classification came back higher, I think we used like 5% higher or something like that, then we would use that as a basis for issuing a change order on the project. But again, that was just what we did. You know, others may not wish to do that.
Hey, Tim, so we're at 11:35. I want to be mindful of everyone's time.
Okay.
So we want to go over this last form.
Okay.
And then if you all still have questions or need clarification, let us know. And then you can also just reach out to your DOH contacts too, and we can have further discussions offline, and having Tim included too, since he's a great resource for this.
So I guess we should put up that the WH, yeah. This is, I can't remember how many pages this is. And this is almost a self-explanatory form. So, you know, this is one of the links that I have there. But this form, I think it's a great tool for figuring out how to fill out a payroll. Some of the things I'm going to point out on payrolls is they need to be consecutively numbered. You do not, people do it 2 ways. You do not have to send in a payroll if nobody worked that week. But, so if somebody worked week 1, you're going to submit that payroll and it's going to be payroll number 1. And then if 2 weeks go by and then somebody works again, that needs to be payroll number 2 and going forward. Now, other people just prefer to submit a weekly payroll regardless whether they work or not. And that's fine too. You mark it as a no work payroll, but you still then have to consecutive number. So if you're going to turn in one every week, then the first week is week 1, the second week is week 2, the third week is week 3. Then somebody works week 4, but that's still payroll 4. So again, it's up to you to figure out how you want to do that, but they do need to be consecutively numbered, and the last one needs to be marked. You know, so if the last one is payroll number 10, then put payroll number 10-final, because otherwise we don't know that we've got the last one and we're going to keep on expecting more from you. So Just very important to consecutively number them and make sure you mark the last one. Yeah, I don't think we really have time to do a step-by-step on here, but I'll point out some of the important things. So when you're reporting the hours, the employees' hours, it is the hours they worked on the Davis-Bacon project only. So if you're an electrician and yeah, you only worked 1 day on this project, but the employee worked a full work week, you are only listing the hours they worked on this project. Now, where you're going through to all the other payroll information, that is for what they totally, earned that week in terms of, their deductions and, I shouldn't have worn my contacts because I'm not able to read this really well, but, but you are going to be marking, their full earnings and then their full deductions. But in terms of the Davis-Bacon portion of this, or the actual hours they worked portion, you're going to just be putting what they worked on this project and the rate of pay they received on this project. So the total hours and their wage rate. The other thing that I think is of note, you may have a general laborer and he does a lot of cleanup on the site, and so he classifies as a laborer. He's not building the house, he's not running the saws or anything, but maybe part of what he's doing is at the end of the day, there's all these different waste canisters sitting around that he needs to get to the dumpster, so he hops in the Bobcat and he goes and he picks up all those trash cans and takes them and dumps them in the dumpster. Unfortunately, if he's running a Bobcat, he's not a common laborer. That's a piece of heavy equipment. Now, just because he ran that Bobcat for an hour, does that mean you have to pay him that wage rate? And the answer is no, as long as you want to track it separately. So you can write him down and you can list him as a laborer and the hours he was a laborer, and then you can also, on another line, list him as a skid steer operator or whatever for an hour and pay him that rate for an hour. I think that might be arrowed down. I think that might be on the next. Yeah, I think there's an example of that, in that. So again, one person can be classified as multiple things. You just have to make sure you do track, and reflect that on the wage decision. If the two jobs he does are almost identical in pay, you may not want to mess with it. But yeah, if there's a significant difference between what he might do for an hour a day versus what his normal job is, you might want to track those separately. Oh, well, and just another point I like to make, just make sure you are using a classification on the wage decision or a new classification, the classification you'd requested and that you got, or don't try to, get creative. Like I said, putting it down to the detail of, what that person specifically did. If he's a drywall hanger, he's a drywall hanger. It doesn't matter if all he's running is the screw gun, that's still part of hanging drywall. So don't, so call him a drywall hanger. Oh yeah, I don't know why they did two. I think if I'm not mistaken, don't they? Yeah, they have overtime as the first one and standard pay as the second line under each column. I wish they would have done it the other way around. That's just one of my pet peeves, but so their standard time and hours go actually on that second row of lines down under their column and their name, and any overtime above that. I guess maybe go up to the next one. I'm not trying to get too. Oh yeah, here is the page that talks about the two classifications for the employee working. I don't know, maybe I should just ask if there's any question. What's on the, is there one more page of this? Provide explanation. Oh, deductions. Okay. So, you know, there's normal deductions, your Social Security, your workman's comp, you know, things like, well, those aren't necessarily, workman's comp wouldn't be a deduction because that's paid by the employer. But anyway, you're going to run into situations where there are other deductions. Maybe you have a voluntary savings account and they're participating in that. It's a good idea to make sure you've gotten those employees to sign a thing, you know, indicating that these deductions are approved by them. You know, maybe you give people an option to use a company truck. If they use a company truck, they've got to pay mileage or something. So you deduct that, calculate it, and deduct that from their check. You just, if there's any other than normal deductions, you need to make sure you've got that documented. You might have garnishment of wages order. And so there's a deduction for that garnishment. And so it's always a good idea to make sure that you've provided us with that garnishment order so that it is a legitimate deduction from the paycheck. Okay, anything else? Again, it just lets you know, you know, what you've got here. Again, this is where I kind of like people to fill out, you know, their fringe benefits, to let me know what they are and what that amount is. But everybody likes things a little differently. So I guess I will ask for questions.
So we don't have questions coming in yet.
Okay.
Looks like we could give folks maybe a minute or two to type something in.
Or if it's a long question, type a real short one saying you're asking a question. Oh, no, yeah, it's the contractors or the subcontractors that have to fill out the forms. And they have to sign it. They're certifying this payroll that this is, you know, correct and accurate as to what they paid their people. Well,
All right, thank you everyone for joining us.
thank you for putting up with me.
And if you guys have any questions, we'll have all of our contact information is on our website. Like I said, this meeting is going to be recorded and we are going to put it up on our website, and we'll let you know once it has been put up on the website. But yeah, feel free to ask or reach out to your AMs and DBOs if questions pop up for you. And just a heads up, we do our next webinar for next month will be over MeBeWeB Section 3, Section 504, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, and talking about the marketing plan that goes with that as well. So feel free to register. You can do that on our website. And then if there's any trainings that come to mind that you would like for us to put on, please let Jennifer or myself know, because we want to make sure we cater this to what you agencies need. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.